The day was as close to perfect as one could get, with the sky a clear, brilliant blue and the temperature hovering just above 75 degrees. The summer heat was present but not unbearable, and the sun seemed to shine with an inviting warmth. The local country club, known for its exclusive reputation and pristine grounds, was the ideal spot for a relaxing afternoon. The sparkling pool, with its shimmering water, beckoned to those who could afford to enjoy it. Before we move on to telling this story, we want to hear your opinion. Write to us in the comments, what is your name and where are you looking from? Your support is very important to us and helps our growing channel to develop and reach more people. Every comment, every like, every post brings us closer to creating a community that defends justice. Thank you for participating with us in this important event. Michael and Karen had been planning this day for weeks. Life had been busy, Michael's demanding career at the FBI, Karen's work as a teacher, and the endless tasks of raising two young children had kept them on their toes. The idea of a day off, a day spent by the pool with no responsibilities, felt like a much-needed escape. The children, Taylor and Naomi, were full of energy and excitement as they clambered into their swimsuits and ran to the pool's edge, eager to jump into the water. Michael, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s, looked every bit the professional in his crisp, casual attire. His black polo and khaki shorts, paired with dark sunglasses, made him stand out as someone who had worked hard to get to where he was. He had grown used to people noticing him, perhaps because of his presence, his demeanor, or simply because he didn't look like most people at places like this. But he was proud of who he was, of what he had accomplished, and that pride radiated from him in the way he held himself, even when it went unacknowledged by others. Karen, his wife, was equally striking. Her deep brown eyes reflected both warmth and intelligence, and her smile was one that put everyone at ease. She had always been the more nurturing one of the pair, a loving and attentive mother, especially to their children, Taylor and Naomi. Both kids were full of life. Taylor, the older of the two at 10, was a lively boy with a keen sense of adventure and a natural knack for making friends. Naomi, just 7, was more reserved but equally as playful, her laugh infectious as she splashed water in all directions. The pool was large, its cool water rippling gently in the light breeze. Michael sat on a lounge chair near the poolside, the backrest reclined slightly, his gaze on the children as they frolicked in the shallow end. Karen was beside him, applying sunscreen to her arms and shoulders, occasionally glancing up at the kids, then back at Michael with a look of contentment. The worries of the world seemed miles away in this moment, a brief escape from their usual hustle. They had always tried to maintain a normal family life despite the pressures of Michael's work. The FBI had its demands, and often those demands came at the cost of time spent at home. But today, it was just the four of them, the sun, and the coolness of the water. For the moment, everything seemed perfect. They were simply a family enjoying a day at the pool, just like any other family would. Michael's thoughts wandered for a moment as he watched his children playing. There was something serene about seeing them so carefree, their innocence shielded from the harsh realities of the world. He was proud of them and knew they were growing up in a different world than he had. But that didn't mean they would be free from the prejudices that still plagued society, especially people of color. He was determined to protect them from the ugliness he knew existed outside the bubble of their family life, but there were some things no parent could control. "Are you okay?" Karen's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She had finished with the sunscreen and was now watching him, a knowing look on her face. "Just thinking," he said, offering her a smile. "How lucky we are to have a day like this." She smiled back, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "We deserve it." Michael nodded. They did deserve this. After all, he had worked his entire life to provide for his family, to give them the safety and comfort they deserved. The FBI was demanding, but it was a career that had brought him respect and a sense of purpose. Yet, no matter what he had achieved, he knew that there would always be some who would see him as less than, simply because of the color of his skin. His thoughts were interrupted by Taylor's excited shout as he jumped into the deep end of the pool, causing a wave that splashed over Naomi, who let out a squeal of delight. Michael's heart swelled with affection, and for a moment, all that mattered was this: his family, here and now, safe and happy. As the children swam, Karen leaned over to Michael, her voice low but teasing. "Maybe we should take a swim ourselves," she suggested, a playful glint in her eye. Michael chuckled, enjoying the light-heartedness of the moment. "Maybe later," he said, not yet ready to leave the peace of his lounge chair. But he could tell that Karen had other plans. Her smile was one of those smiles that meant she would get her way eventually. The sound of splashing and laughter continued as Michael turned his attention back to the children. He watched as they kicked their legs in the water, their joy so untainted by the world around them. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that things were not as calm as they seemed. In the back of his mind, he knew that even in places like this, some things would never change. He couldn't have known just how true that feeling would be, how quickly it would all come crashing down, turning this idyllic day into a nightmare. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, before everything was about to change. The peaceful afternoon, bathed in golden sunlight, lingered for only a short while longer. Michael was still basking in the serenity of the moment, his eyes following the movements of his children in the water. Naomi had begun practicing her backstroke, her small hands slicing through the water with an exaggerated grace, while Taylor floated on his back, letting the waves carry him. Karen leaned back on the lounge chair, flipping through the pages of a book, occasionally glancing up at the children or Michael with a smile. Everything seemed ordinary, but the ordinary had a way of shifting when least expected. The first sign that something was amiss came as a distant, low hum. A sound that barely registered at first. It was the sound of a car engine, but not one of the typical sedans or luxury vehicles that came and went from the club. This was the distinct rumble of a police cruiser, its tires pressing against the gravel as it pulled into the parking lot. Michael's attention was momentarily diverted, but he didn't think much of it. Country clubs, after all, were places where affluent members often felt the need to call in security over minor inconveniences. Perhaps a parking dispute, or someone getting too close to the wrong poolside chair. But then, the car stopped, its engine cutting off abruptly. The sound of doors opening and closing echoed in the stillness. Michael caught the flash of a police officer's uniform, the reflective sheen of a badge glinting in the sunlight. The officers were walking toward the pool. Michael's stomach tightened, a feeling he had learned to recognize all too well. He knew what was coming. The two officers approached with an air of purpose, their expressions unreadable as they walked past the rows of lounge chairs. Their eyes scanned the pool area, briefly lingering on a few of the club members, before coming to rest on Michael and his family. They looked out of place, almost foreign, in this setting, their uniforms starkly contrasting with the casual luxury that surrounded them. Michael couldn't help but notice how their eyes shifted to him. They looked at his family, then back to him. It was the kind of look he had come to know all too well in his life, the subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement that they saw something in him that didn't belong. It wasn't overt, not yet, but the tension was there. And Michael, ever aware of the undertones of racism that could slip through even the most mundane moments, felt it instantly. Karen noticed it too. She sat up slightly, putting her book down. Her gaze flicked to Michael, then back to the officers. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly, her voice laced with uncertainty. Michael nodded, though his expression betrayed a flicker of concern. "Let's just wait and see," he said, but his tone was cautious. The officers, still walking toward them, finally stopped a few paces away. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with a stony face and a posture that made him appear rigid, almost confrontational. The other, shorter and stockier, had a look of quiet suspicion in his eyes. They both stood there for a moment, scanning Michael and his family, before the taller officer spoke. "You're not members here," he said, his voice direct but with an undercurrent of authority that made Michael bristle slightly. Michael's brow furrowed. "We are guests of Mr. Phelps. He knows we're here." Mr. Phelps, the club's manager, was well known in the area. He'd been the one to welcome them to the pool earlier that afternoon, even offering to get them towels if they needed anything. The idea that they might have been mistaken for non-members was ridiculous, and Michael knew it. But the officer wasn't interested in explanations. "I don't care who invited you," the officer replied, his tone growing sharper. "We've had complaints." "Complaints?" Michael asked, surprised at the vagueness of the accusation. "What kind of complaints?" The officer's eyes narrowed, and Michael could see the slow flicker of irritation beginning to surface. "The kind of complaints that get people like you removed from places like this," he said, his words laced with a kind of subtle menace. Karen's hand tightened on Michael's wrist, her grip cool and steady, but there was no hiding the anxiety in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but Michael placed a gentle hand on her arm, signaling her to stay calm. "We're not causing any trouble," Michael said firmly, his voice even but measured. "We're just enjoying a day by the pool. We're not breaking any rules." The shorter officer, who had been silent up until this point, stepped forward, his gaze lingering on Michael for a moment before shifting to Karen and then the children. "I said, we've had complaints. You need to leave. Now." The air between them grew thick with tension. Michael's pulse quickened. He knew what this was. It wasn't about rules or membership, it was about something far more insidious. The officers weren't responding to a legitimate concern, they were responding to something far simpler, the color of his skin. Michael could see the barely contained hostility in their eyes, the way their bodies stiffened at his presence. He had dealt with this countless times before, police who were quick to assume, quick to judge, and even quicker to act. Karen's voice broke through the stillness, low but firm. "This isn't right," she said, her eyes flashing with defiance. "We're guests. We're not breaking any rules. You can't just tell us to leave." The officer's jaw tightened. His hand hovered near his belt, where his gun was holstered, and Michael felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The confrontation was escalating. Taylor, oblivious to the growing tension, called out from the pool, asking if they could play a game of volleyball. Naomi echoed him, her voice high-pitched with excitement. The innocence of their words, of their joy, stood in stark contrast to the hostile, heavy atmosphere settling in around the family. Michael glanced over at them, his heart aching. They didn't deserve this. They were just kids, enjoying a day like anyone else. The officers didn't seem to notice the children. Their focus was squarely on Michael now, their faces set in a rigid determination that spoke of something far deeper than mere authority. "I said, you need to leave," the officer repeated, his voice much sharper this time. For a moment, Michael considered pulling out his FBI badge, showing it to the officers and ending the conversation. But a nagging feeling held him back. He knew how these situations played out. It could end with an escalation, with his family caught in the middle of a confrontation that would only further fuel the tension. They were already treating him like an intruder. If he showed his badge, would that matter? Or would it make things worse? Then, without warning, Michael made a decision. He stood up, his muscles tense, his mind racing. He needed to take control of the situation, but not through force, through calm, calculated reasoning. He would show them that they could not dictate the terms of his family's existence, that they had no right to treat them this way. He would not let this moment define them. But as he stepped forward, the taller officer moved instinctively, his hand shifting toward his belt, just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to make Michael freeze. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken words, as if the world around them had narrowed to this single moment of confrontation. And then, just as quickly, the manager, Mr. Phelps, appeared. His hurried footsteps interrupted the standoff, and he waved his hands, signaling to the officers. "Stop! Stop!" Mr. Phelps shouted as he hurried toward them. The relief in Michael's chest was palpable as the tension broke. The officers froze, looking toward him. But Michael could already sense that, despite Mr. Phelps' intervention, the damage had been done. The seed of hostility had been planted. And the world, just for a moment, had shifted. The sudden appearance of Mr. Phelps, the club manager, was like a fragile lifeline thrown into the suffocating tension that had enveloped the poolside. As he hurried toward the officers, his hands raised in a placating gesture, Michael let out a shallow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For a moment, he thought perhaps the situation could be diffused, that Mr. Phelps would clarify the misunderstanding and send the officers on their way. But the officers weren't backing down. They stood their ground, their bodies still stiff with suspicion, though their eyes briefly softened as Mr. Phelps approached. The tall officer, still scanning Michael and his family with a narrowed gaze, looked back at Mr. Phelps with a furrowed brow. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Phelps?" the officer asked, his voice clipped, but still laced with an unmistakable air of authority. It was clear that he didn't appreciate being challenged in front of the very people he had come to confront. Mr. Phelps, breathless from his quick walk, shot the officer a look of disbelief. "There's no problem, officer. These people are my guests," he said, gesturing to Michael and his family. "They're invited to the pool. I personally cleared it with management. You can't just..." The officer didn't let him finish. "I'm afraid we've had complaints, Mr. Phelps. Complaints about the presence of people who don't belong here. You're going to have to ask them to leave." The words hit like a slap, and the shock of it hung in the air. Michael could feel the sudden shift, how, even with Mr. Phelps' authority, the officers still saw this situation as one where their word was final. The club manager's plea was now drowned out by the loud, insistent rhythm of the confrontation. And at the heart of it, Michael could feel the unspoken tension in the officers' eyes, a feeling that they, despite their uniforms and badges, were the ones who determined who was allowed to occupy this space. Michael stood motionless, his hands tightening into fists by his sides. The officers hadn't moved, both of them still positioned in front of him, blocking his path to his children and Karen. The breeze around them shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of chlorine and fresh-cut grass, but it couldn't mask the rising tension. Michael knew, deep in his bones, what was happening here. This wasn't about pool membership, rules, or complaints. This was about his presence. His skin. His audacity to exist in a space where, to these officers, he did not belong. His thoughts flashed to the many moments in his life when he'd encountered subtle and overt racism, when doors were closed to him for reasons he could never quite understand. But today, it wasn't just about him. It was about his family. About Karen, who was trying to keep her composure, and about his children, who were blissfully unaware of the ugliness unfolding around them. "Michael," Karen's voice broke through his thoughts. Her tone was tight, edged with a mix of fear and frustration. She had stood up now, moving to stand beside him. Her hand was on his arm, but it was trembling ever so slightly. "We can't do this here. Not in front of the kids." Michael nodded, keeping his gaze locked with the officers. He knew Karen was right. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, adrenaline coursing through him, but he knew that reacting with anger wouldn't do anyone any good. He had to stay calm, composed, even though every fiber of his being screamed to lash out. Turning slightly to look at Karen, he whispered, "Stay calm. I'll handle this." His voice was low, but it was steady, a quiet determination that seemed to momentarily quell Karen's anxiety. She took a breath, her fingers loosening their grip on his arm, though she didn't step away. She stood close, her posture protective as she faced the officers with the same steady resolve that Michael was trying to muster. The tall officer spoke again, this time addressing both Michael and Karen. "I'm sorry, sir, but but we've been asked to remove you from the premises. We need you to gather your things and leave immediately." Michael's body tensed at the officer's words. He had expected resistance, but the audacity in the officer's tone cut through him like a knife. Michael clenched his jaw, but didn't let the anger cloud his thoughts. He took a moment to process the situation. "You're mistaken," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "We're not here illegally. We're guests of Mr. Phelps. You're making an error." The shorter officer stepped forward at that moment, his eyes glinting with something that Michael could only read as contempt. "You don't get it, do you? This is a private club. People like you," he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Michael felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. The officer wasn't even pretending anymore. He wasn't hiding the prejudice behind formalities or bureaucracy. He was laying it out plainly, exposing it for all to see. Karen stepped forward, her voice rising slightly in disbelief. "People like us? What does that even mean?" she demanded, her eyes now blazing with fury. Her voice had an edge to it, but she wasn't shouting. She was simply standing her ground. The officer didn't answer, but instead his hand inched closer to his holstered gun, his body language turning more defensive, almost anticipating that Michael might make a move. It was a subtle gesture, but one that Michael recognized instantly, a readiness to escalate, to assume the worst in him, a black man in a predominantly white space. Michael's heart raced. He saw the officers' eyes flick to each other, gauging their next move. They were on the verge of something that could turn into something much worse. The space between them felt like it was shrinking, and in that moment, Michael knew he had two choices: back down and submit to their unjust demands, or push back, risking the safety of his family in the process. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Mr. Phelps interjected once more, his voice louder this time. "Enough!" Mr. Phelps shouted, his voice carrying authority now that the officers had no room to ignore him. "These are my guests, and I will not have you treating them this way. If you don't have a legitimate reason to remove them, then you need to leave." The tall officer took a step back, his jaw tightening as he glanced at his partner. The brief silence that followed was thick with tension, each second stretching longer than the last. Michael could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the few other club members who had begun to notice the confrontation, the children's quiet confusion as they glanced from one adult to another. And then, with a suddenness that startled Michael, the officers began to step away, their posture stiff, their eyes never quite meeting Michael's. "Don't think this is over," the tall officer muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "We'll be watching." The words hung in the air long after the officers had turned and left, their cruiser driving slowly out of the lot, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. But the damage was done. Michael stood there for a long moment, the tension in his body slowly unwinding, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The fear that had gripped Karen's hand, the disbelief in his children's eyes, this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a painful reminder of the world they still lived in, a world where, despite his accomplishments, despite the respect he had earned, he was still seen through the lens of racism. For a moment, there was silence, a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Then, Michael turned toward his family, his gaze softening as he saw their confused and worried expressions. "It's okay," he said quietly, though he knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sound of the police cruiser fading into the distance was a small, hollow victory for Michael and his family. The tension that had built up so suddenly now lingered like a cloud hanging low above them, casting a shadow over what should have been a relaxing day. The harsh words, the narrow-eyed stares, the barely veiled threat, all of it echoed in Michael's mind, replaying over and over in an attempt to make sense of what had just happened. Mr. Phelps, his expression still tense but now visibly trying to make amends, stood awkwardly beside Michael and Karen. His hands, which had once been raised in a conciliatory gesture toward the officers, were now clasped nervously in front of him. "I'm so sorry about that," Mr. Phelps said, his voice low but urgent. "I had no idea it would escalate like that. This kind of thing doesn't happen here, not under my watch. I'll make sure it's addressed, and the officers will be reprimanded." Michael glanced at him, his face impassive, though inside a storm of frustration and disbelief churned. "Reprimanded," he said, his voice colder than he intended. "Do you really think that's going to fix anything? It's not about reprimands. It's about what happened today, what they saw, what they think, and how they treated us. You can't just make it go away with an apology." Karen stepped in, her voice softer now but still filled with a sharpness Michael knew well. "Mr. Phelps, we were your guests. You should have been on our side the moment they walked up. Instead, you stood by while they treated us like criminals." Her eyes met his, and there was no mistaking the hurt in her voice. "You can't fix that with words." The manager flinched, his face reddening. He opened his mouth to speak but paused, unsure how to respond. It was clear he was struggling with his own discomfort in the face of what had happened, trying to balance his allegiance to the club and the recognition that his guests had been mistreated in a way he couldn't simply explain away. Michael's gaze shifted toward the pool, watching Naomi and Taylor, their innocent joy now a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. His heart clenched. How would they understand? How could he explain this to them, without shattering the safe world they had come to know? Naomi, her eyes wide and confused, swam over to the side of the pool where Michael stood. She climbed out, water dripping from her small frame as she approached him, her expression unsure. "Daddy," she said, her voice small. "Why were those men being mean to us? What did we do?" The question hit him like a gut punch. Michael knelt down to her, forcing a smile, though the sorrow in his chest tightened his throat. "We didn't do anything wrong, sweetie," he said softly. "Sometimes, people just make mistakes. But we didn't do anything wrong." His voice faltered for a moment, the truth of the situation threatening to unravel him. "Sometimes, people just don't like others because of the color of their skin. And when that happens, it's up to us to stand tall, to be proud of who we are, and to not let them take away our peace." Naomi nodded, though her young mind couldn't fully grasp the complexity of what had happened. She still sensed the tension, the fear in the air, and it made her feel small. She clung to her father's leg for a moment, then turned and ran back to the water, her figure growing smaller as she rejoined her brother. Michael stood, his gaze hardening. He wanted to explain it all, but how could he? How could he explain the danger of simply existing in a world that was not built for him? A world where his very presence, his mere existence, could provoke such hostility? But as he stood there, his thoughts racing, a dangerous idea began to form. The officers had left. For now. But Michael knew that the mere threat of confrontation, the subtle challenge to their authority, could invite a return. What if they decided to escalate things further? What if they showed up again, this time not with words, but with force? And even if Mr. Phelps had promised action, Michael didn't trust that his apology or reprimands would do anything to correct the systemic issues that allowed this kind of treatment to happen in the first place. The fear of being wronged, of being treated as less than, that feeling he had always carried, it was now personal. His family had been humiliated, harassed, and pushed aside by people who held power in this space. He couldn't just walk away, pretending that it didn't matter. Michael's mind raced as he felt a surge of anger, a primal urge to not just stand up for his family, but to confront the injustice head-on. He had spent years of his life, as a man and as an agent of the FBI, putting up with subtle and overt racism, but never had he felt this type of anger bubbling to the surface. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't let this moment pass. It wasn't just a personal affront, it was something larger, something deeper, a reminder of the world that people like him, like his children, would always be judged in ways others would never understand. He glanced at Karen, then back at the pool, where Naomi and Taylor were playing, their laughter ringing in the air like music. The sight should have comforted him, but instead, it only deepened his resolve. "We should leave," Karen said quietly, her eyes searching his face. She could sense his internal struggle, the way he was grappling with something unspoken. "Let's just go home." But Michael hesitated. A dangerous idea was taking root in his mind, an idea that would send a clear message. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like something he had to do. Not just for his own sense of justice, but for the safety of other families who might come to this pool, or any other space, and find themselves treated the same way. He could not allow this to go unchallenged. He turned back to Mr. Phelps. "Mr. Phelps, I need you to make one more call," Michael said, his voice steady, but with an unmistakable edge to it. "I want the officers' names. I want their badge numbers. I want to speak with them." The manager looked at him, confusion evident in his eyes. "What for?" "I'm not letting this go," Michael said flatly, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that startled the manager. "This isn't just about leaving or being apologized to. This is about accountability." Karen's hand went to Michael's arm, squeezing gently. Her face was a mask of concern, but she understood his resolve. This wasn't just about today, this was about ensuring that the officers who thought they could act with impunity would face consequences. "Michael, don't," Karen said softly. "This is dangerous. They won't take it well." But Michael's mind was made up. He could feel the heavy weight of what was at stake. If they just walked away now, if they accepted the apology and the empty promises, nothing would change. This mistake, this gross display of racial prejudice, needed to be acknowledged. It couldn't be swept under the rug. He looked at Mr. Phelps, his gaze hardening. "Get me their names. Or I'll make sure this goes much further." The manager hesitated, then slowly nodded, sensing that Michael wasn't going to back down. The weight of the decision was heavy on Michael's shoulders, but he knew, deep down, that it was the right one. The course had been set. The mistake the officers made today wouldn't be forgotten. And neither would the lessons they were about to learn. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the very atmosphere around them was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Michael stood beside Karen, his posture rigid, his mind focused on the next steps. Mr. Phelps, reluctantly complicit in the whole ordeal, had finally agreed to provide the names and badge numbers of the officers, though his discomfort was palpable. His eyes darted nervously as he pulled out his phone, dialing the number for the local police department. Michael's decision to take action had been swift, driven by a deep need to make sure this moment wasn't just another stain on his family's history, swept under the rug and forgotten. But even as the manager spoke with the dispatcher, Michael's mind was occupied with the greater danger they now faced. He knew this wasn't just about getting the officers reprimanded. That was a small consolation in the face of the larger, systemic issue at hand. "Michael, please," Karen murmured, her voice threaded with anxiety. She reached for his arm, trying to pull him out of his thoughts, to bring him back to the present. "This isn't safe. You're talking about going up against the police." "I know, Karen," Michael replied softly, his voice steady but heavy. "But it's bigger than that now. It's not just them, it's the entire system that allows this to happen. I can't just ignore it. I can't sit back and let them think they're above reproach." Karen exhaled sharply, her brow furrowing with concern. "But what about us? What about the kids? What if they come back?" Michael met her gaze, seeing the fear in her eyes. He could feel the weight of her worry, the tension that had already permeated their lives, and he knew that this was about more than just righting a wrong. This was about ensuring the safety of their family, about making sure that they weren't the ones who paid the price for standing up. He wanted to reassure her, but he didn't have any guarantees to offer. "We'll be okay," he said, though even he wasn't entirely sure. His words were more for himself than for her, a quiet mantra he repeated to steady his nerves. He could feel the fight rising within him, the need to confront not just the officers, but everything they represented. He wasn't just an individual in this moment, he was a symbol for so many who had been unfairly targeted, harassed, or outright oppressed. Mr. Phelps handed Michael the officer's information after a few agonizing minutes of back and forth with the dispatcher. The man looked uneasy, as though he was fully aware of the kind of trouble his club, and his complicity, could face if this situation escalated further. "I've got their names and badge numbers. Just be careful, okay? I don't want any more trouble." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening as he took the slip of paper, his fingers trembling slightly. He could feel the weight of it in his hand, each letter and number etched into his mind. It was an official step in the process now. There was no turning back. His grip on the paper tightened. "I'm not the one who's going to bring trouble," he said quietly, his voice like steel. "They've already done that." Karen was silent, but her hand remained on his arm, her touch grounding him even as his mind raced. She knew there was no way to talk him out of it now. Michael had made up his mind, and no amount of concern, no matter how valid, was going to stop him. The children were still playing, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed over their family. Naomi and Taylor's laughter, once a joyful sound, now seemed to pierce Michael's conscience. He knew that this world they were trying to protect them from, was always lurking just beneath the surface. And no matter how many times he tried to shield them, no matter how many safe spaces he found for them, it could always erupt like this. At that moment, he knew he had to act, not just for himself, but for them. He couldn't allow this world to remain the way it was for them. They would face it, sooner or later. And he would do whatever it took to ensure that they didn't face it alone. The next steps were clear. Michael had already made calls of his own, tapping into his network in the FBI. He'd reached out to a few trusted colleagues, asking them to check the records of the officers who had accosted his family. It didn't take long before a few telling details came to light. The officers had a history of complaints, some of them related to racial profiling, others tied to misconduct within the department. They were dangerous in more ways than one. As the minutes passed, Michael could feel the clock ticking. The longer he delayed, the more the danger would fester. It was time to go further, to dig deeper, to shine a light on this entire system of privilege and unchecked power. The truth was, Michael knew what had to happen next. His professional instincts, those finely honed by years of working for the FBI, kicked into gear. This wasn't about petty revenge or personal vendettas. This was about exposing the rot at the core of an institution that claimed to protect, but instead had become a tool for maintaining a status quo built on inequality and fear. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was an update from a contact in the department. The officers had already been flagged in their system, but there was more, something unexpected. They were currently under investigation for a separate incident involving excessive force during an arrest. It seemed that the officers' behavior was already being scrutinized by internal affairs. Michael's heart raced at the news. This was no coincidence. He had known, deep down, that this moment had arrived to confront them on a larger scale. It wasn't just about his family anymore, it was about making sure these officers never had the opportunity to abuse their power again. He looked at Karen, his mind now laser-focused. "It's bigger than we thought," he said, the urgency in his voice impossible to ignore. "They're already under investigation. This isn't just about today. This is about stopping them from doing this to others." Karen nodded slowly, her face a mix of fear and pride. She understood. This was bigger than them, bigger than their family's pain. This was a turning point, one they couldn't turn away from. Michael wasn't going to back down. Not this time. As Michael made the final call to his superiors at the FBI, he could feel the weight of the moment closing in around him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the sense of impending change. This would be the breaking point for the officers, and for the system that had allowed them to wield their power unchecked. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And Michael knew, with chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning of the storm. The hours that followed were a blur of phone calls, exchanges of information, and mounting tension. Michael felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting, the world just slightly off balance, as if everything he knew was about to fracture. With every conversation, every update, the truth became clearer: the officers who had harassed his family were just a symptom of something far larger, a deeply entrenched network of racial bias, misconduct, and unchecked power. But the weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for his family anymore, it was about confronting an entire system that had allowed these officers, and many like them, to act with impunity. He could feel the enormity of what he was about to do: challenge the system head-on, bring to light everything that had been swept under the rug for far too long. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting for something much more personal. His children's future. The quiet hum of the suburban neighborhood felt foreign to him now, as if the world around him had forgotten to acknowledge the storm brewing at the center of their lives. The pool, once a place of respite and leisure, now seemed like a distant memory. The white-tiled edges glistening under the harsh sun, the laughter of his children, the cool water, everything felt like it belonged to another time. A time before the racial tension had ruptured their sense of peace. Karen sat beside him, her fingers interlaced with his, the silence between them heavy. He could feel her heart racing in her palm, her unease palpable. She wasn't sure how far this was going to go, and a part of her wished they could just leave it all behind. But the truth was, she knew that was impossible. The moment was bigger than them. The moment was bigger than the quiet life they had tried to build. "I'm scared, Michael," she said finally, her voice low, almost imperceptible. "What if this backfires? What if it makes things worse for us, especially for the kids?" Michael turned to her, his gaze softening as he held her hand. His chest tightened at the thought of what might come next. He had spent years working in the FBI, building a career on precision and control, but this felt different. This felt personal. There was no way to predict what the repercussions would be, and though he tried to reassure Karen with his calm, inside he was unraveling at the edges. "We don't have a choice, Karen," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "What happened today, it's not just about what those officers did. It's about every other time something like this happens and no one says anything. I can't let this slide. I won't let them hurt anyone else like this. We need to make sure they know that this isn't okay." Karen exhaled deeply, nodding reluctantly. She knew, deep down, that he was right. She had always known that Michael couldn't sit idly by when it came to matters of justice. But this was a different kind of fight, one that had the potential to unravel everything. The phone buzzed again, pulling them both from the silence. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he reached for it, recognizing the number of one of his colleagues in the FBI. He swiped to answer, his grip tightening on the phone. The moment of truth had arrived. "Michael," the voice on the other end said, the tone serious, but with a hint of reassurance. "We've got the intel. The officers who confronted you, they've been flagged for multiple complaints, including racial profiling. But here's the thing, there's more to the story. These guys are tied to a group within the department, a kind of underground network that's been harboring these kinds of behaviors for years." The revelation hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He had suspected that the officers weren't just rogue elements, but hearing it confirmed, that there was a network of corruption and systemic bias within the police force, left him feeling hollow. The realization that these officers weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger problem, felt like a gut-wrenching truth. "We're gathering evidence," the voice continued, "but you need to be careful. If they find out you're involved, they could retaliate, and it won't be pretty." Michael clenched his jaw, the weight of the words sinking deep. He was well aware of the dangers of exposing a corrupt network within law enforcement. Whistleblowers weren't often met with gratitude, but with a well-oiled campaign of silence, intimidation, and destruction. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about protecting his own family, it was about exposing the brokenness of the system itself. "I'm not backing down," Michael said, his voice steady, though his mind raced. "We've come too far." On the other end, there was a pause. "We're with you, Michael. Just, be careful. This is bigger than you think." The call ended, and the weight of the decision settled over him. He looked up at Karen, his gaze unyielding. She could see the resolve in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to a career in the FBI, the same fire that would propel him forward now. "Michael," Karen began, her voice trembling. "You're sure? You know what this means, don't you?" "I know," he replied quietly, the gravity of the moment clear in his voice. "I'm sure." The next morning, as dawn broke, Michael and Karen prepared for the next steps. A meeting with Internal Affairs had been set. He had gathered every piece of information they had, from the officers' records to the complaints filed against them. He wasn't walking into that room just as a concerned citizen, he was walking in as an agent of the FBI, as a man who had spent his entire life studying systems of corruption and abuse. But the cost was heavy. He knew the risks: retaliation, backlash, and the inevitable pushback from a system that had always prioritized its own protection over accountability. He knew the fight would be long and grueling, but it was a fight he couldn't avoid. The truth had to come out. As they left the house, Michael's hand firmly gripping the folder containing everything they had, Karen glanced at him one last time, her eyes filled with the kind of quiet strength that had always been there, even in the darkest of times. She was afraid, but she understood. The car ride to the office felt like a journey toward something unknown, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Michael's mind raced with what lay ahead. Internal Affairs would be their first point of contact, but Michael knew there was more to do. There were calls to make, people to speak with. He wasn't just exposing the officers who had wronged them, he was exposing an entire system that had allowed them to operate with impunity for far too long. The moment of truth had arrived, and there would be no turning back. Michael steeled himself for what lay ahead. He couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Not ever. The weight of what had transpired was still settling in as Michael and Karen stood in the sterile, unwelcoming office of Internal Affairs. The coldness of the room mirrored the uncertainty in their hearts, the sense of impending consequence looming like a storm on the horizon. Michael's hands were steady as he placed the folder onto the desk before the officers, but inside, he felt his pulse quicken, the enormity of what they were about to do weighing on him like a leaden burden. Inside the walls of the office, things moved quickly. The officers in Internal Affairs had already received their intel, everything Michael had collected, from the officers' history of misconduct to the deeper, more insidious network within the department. He could see the recognition in their eyes, a flicker of understanding that they were dealing with something far larger than a single act of racial bias. But there was also the unmistakable hesitation, the careful politeness that bordered on wariness. These weren't the faces of justice, at least, not yet. They were the faces of a system that had learned to protect its own. The investigators were professionals, no doubt, but there was a caution in their demeanor that made Michael wary. He couldn't tell whether it was skepticism or genuine concern, but the doubt was palpable. Every word they spoke seemed measured, every move they made cautious, as if they were calculating how to proceed without ruffling too many feathers. Despite the swirling uncertainty, there was a sense of resolve in Michael that couldn't be shaken. He had done the right thing. He knew it, deep down. But even as he clung to that certainty, the bitter taste of fear lingered. He had set in motion a chain of events that he couldn't control, and that realization terrified him. "Thank you for bringing this forward, Agent Washington," one of the investigators said, adjusting his glasses as he skimmed through the paperwork Michael had provided. This is significant. We'll begin reviewing the files immediately, and we'll need your cooperation throughout the process." Michael nodded, his jaw set. His eyes flicked briefly to Karen, who stood beside him, her expression a careful mix of hope and anxiety. The children were safe at home for now, blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding around them. But he couldn't protect them from this storm forever. Soon enough, the ripple effects would touch every aspect of their lives. The next few days blurred together as Michael tried to focus on his work while simultaneously preparing for the fallout. The initial relief of having taken action was slowly replaced by the gnawing uncertainty of what would come next. Internal Affairs promised a thorough investigation, but Michael knew better than to expect quick resolutions. Corruption, especially within a system as entrenched as law enforcement, didn't just disappear overnight. News of the incident, however, had already begun to spread. The public outcry was swift, particularly in their community. Activists, journalists, and civil rights groups picked up on the story, demanding answers. Michael had made the decision to go public with his involvement, and soon enough, his name was splashed across news outlets and social media. Headlines read like a mix of admiration and scrutiny: FBI agent exposes racist cops, Internal Affairs investigates police bias, the cost of standing up, one family's fight against police brutality. For Michael, there was no way to escape the spotlight. The attention was overwhelming. It felt as though his entire life had shifted, and every step he took was being watched, analyzed, criticized. The world had shifted from an abstract sense of justice to a raw, personal reckoning. As the media storm raged on, Michael knew it wasn't just the officers at the pool who were under scrutiny. His actions had pulled back the curtain on a system that had long turned a blind eye to the biases ingrained within its ranks. And now, there were consequences for that. But there were consequences for him, too. The phone calls came, one after the other. Colleagues at the FBI, old friends, and even strangers who had heard the story offered their support. Some were encouraging, proud of his bravery. Others, however, were less sympathetic. "Michael, you're going to get yourself killed," one of his colleagues had said over the phone. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest. It's one thing to go after a few bad apples, but you're challenging the entire system." And it wasn't just the FBI that had started to watch him. The local police, the department his own family had been victimized by, had begun to take a closer interest in him. Michael received several threatening calls, subtle at first, then growing more direct. He could feel the cold eyes of law enforcement following him wherever he went. The hardest part, though, was the toll it took on his family. Karen had always supported him in his work, but this was different. The weight of it had begun to crack their sense of normalcy. The children were hearing things, distorted, exaggerated accounts of what had happened, and questions began to surface at school. "They're asking me if you're going to get in trouble, Daddy," Naomi said quietly one evening, looking up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "They say you're a hero. But they also say you might lose your job." Michael hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected their children to feel the strain of what had started as an isolated incident. They were too young to fully understand the significance, but they knew something had changed. They could sense the tension, the unspoken fears that had crept into their home. For Karen, the quiet, pervasive fear was more present than ever. "What are we doing, Michael?" she had asked late one night, her voice fragile. This isn't the world we wanted for them. We thought we could protect them from all of this." "I'm doing what I have to do," Michael replied, his voice strained with exhaustion. "What we have to do. You know that." But Karen was right in one respect: this was no longer just about him or his career. It was about them, about their family. And as much as Michael believed in the cause, he couldn't ignore the fear that clouded his thoughts. What if this decision cost them everything? What if, in exposing this ugliness, he had put them all at greater risk? The weeks stretched on, and the investigation into the officers deepened. Internal Affairs was thorough, and eventually, the officers were put on administrative leave. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a step. More importantly, the ripple effect began to grow. Protests erupted in the community, local leaders called for reform, and a broader conversation about systemic racism in law enforcement was finally underway. But for Michael, the personal cost was high. The emotional toll of having his entire life scrutinized, the fear for his family's safety, the uncertainty of his career, it all weighed heavily on him. The system that had once felt so solid beneath his feet now seemed shaky, like a foundation on the verge of collapse. Still, in the midst of the chaos, Michael found solace in one thing: he had done the right thing. No matter what came next, he had stood up. He had fought back when so many others had been silenced. And that, he knew, would have to be enough. In the days that followed, the officers were placed on administrative leave. Their future in the department was uncertain, and the public's distrust of law enforcement grew stronger. Michael, despite his personal grief, knew that this was a pivotal moment. The officers had learned the hard way that racism and prejudice would no longer go unchecked. Their actions had consequences far beyond a single confrontation. They had sparked a reckoning that could not be ignored. For Michael and his family, the ordeal was far from over. The emotional scars would linger, but they were determined to use this experience to educate others about the ugly reality of racism and discrimination. Michael's life as an FBI agent had always been about fighting for justice, but this event had brought him face to face with a harsh truth: the fight for justice was far from over. The lesson for the officers was simple, yet profound: their biases had led them to make the wrong call. In a moment of racial ignorance, they had nearly caused irreversible harm. It was a lesson in humanity, one they would not soon forget.